Now that another year has come and gone, we thought it would be a great opportunity to take a look back at 2013 and see what type of weather it brought to the region. I think overall most people would agree that the weather was rather tame by West Texas standards, but that doesn't mean that we didn't see the occasional active weather across the southern Texas Panhandle, South Plains, and Rolling Plains in 2013, and we're going to take a lot greater look at that in more detail here over the coming slides. First, we'll just look at kind of a regional perspective. This is the precipitation that fell in 2013. And you can see a lot of variability, but in general, most people saw anywhere between 12 and 20 inches or so of rainfall. Were a few drier pockets across the southwest Panhandle and northwestern South Plains, from Friona over to Dimmitt and up to Hereford, as well as in the southwestern South Plains, at least especially around Terry County, around Brownfield, and down into Seminole and Seagraves, where rainfall totals for the year were generally under 12 inches. There were some pockets as well where they saw 20 inches or more of rainfall. And we'll look at a little more in detail at this on the next slide. This graphic also shows the rainfall that fell in 2013. And what's actually shaded in is the percent of normal, with the yellows and lighter greens showing generally under what you'd typically expect for a normal year. With rainfall averaging anywhere from 60 to 90%, being fairly common over much of the area. There were some pockets where you see those darker blues shaded, where they did actually record more precipitation than you'd expect on average, most notably down near Denver City, and then up around Caprock Canyon State Park. Littlefield also joined in the fun. They were, looks like, slightly above average. The precipitation, although generally a little below average, as we saw in the last couple of graphics, was greater than we've seen over the last couple of years for most places, and that did help to improve our drought standing a little bit. In the upper left-hand side, you see a graphic of our drought monitor back in the beginning of 2013, January 1st. A lot of reds up there where the drought was extreme and even in some cases exceptional. With our little more regular rainfall throughout the year, we did see improvements, though we still remain mired in a drought through the year. At the end of the year, on the lower right, you can see there was improvement, though still at least moderate drought for moderate to severe drought for much of the region, with some extreme and even exceptional drought remaining in northwest Texas. So the trend was good. Still could use more rain, though. Here's a lot of information on these graphics here. The upper left shows the plot of the temperatures, and this is from the Lubbock airport, so this is explicitly from Lubbock. The black line is the highs and lows plotted each day of the year, so a lot of variability there. And then the reds are the record highs for each day, and the blues are the record lows for each day and date, and then the blues are the normal highs and lows. So you can see how the temperature fluctuated throughout the year. A lot of things to see here. We won't dwell on any one particular thing too much, but you can see during the spring months, as we go into late March, April, and early May, was a lot of variability. Saw some very warm temperatures approaching record highs, but then they were followed by some very cool temperatures with near or even at record lows in some cases. Temperature dipped below freezing almost every week after a strong cold front moved through, pretty regularly every week. And we saw those those freezing temperatures extend even into early May, so some freezes that went well beyond what is average. And then another interesting thing you can see is if you look at July, in the middle of July we had a cool period that was punctuated by a westward moving upper level low, which is fairly rare, but it did visit West Texas and brought us a lot of cloud cover, a lot of rainfall, and kept temperatures very cool. So that was kind of a pleasant stretch of relief there in the middle of the summer. And then as you get towards the end of the year, we saw a lot of variability as well, which is fairly common, but we had two particularly warm stretches in November and then into December, middle of December, but they were also adjacent to two very cold stretches, one in the latter November and then in early December when we saw some very cold air move in. And we'll look a little more detail at this in just a second. The bottom part of the upper left graph shows the precipitation for the year at the Lubbock airport. The green area shaded is the observed rainfall. And then the tan area is what you'd normally expect. And you can see we did start off fairly wet. A couple of good storm systems moved through, brought us some moisture to the region. But then by late March, we fell below normal and never could quite recover. We tried, had some decent rainfalls throughout the year, but never could quite make it back to average. In fact, finished several inches below average. In the lower right-hand graph here, this is actually a plot of the average temperature at Lubbock, daily temperature, and what's plotted is plotted with respect to average, with the red lines being a day that was above average by however many degrees it shows, and then the blue lines being below average. And we do also have a 10-day running mean in there, that black line, which just gives you a kind of a broader trend of how things were going through the year. But you can see a lot of variability as well. Particular note is that cold stretch in December. We saw a day where the average temperature was more than 25 degrees below what you'd normally expect, your average temperature. So that is a very cold stretch there. And we did have some other very cold stretches in spring there. You can see behind those strong cold fronts when we saw those late freezing temperatures into April and early May. And we did see some warm stretches too, no big surprise, but the warmest absolute day was in late January when we were over 20 degrees above average. Saw quite a few days around 10 to 15 degrees above average scattered throughout the year. This is another way to look at some of that information. This is also at the Lubbock Airport, broken down by months, the average highs, lows, and precipitation. Won't dwell on the details here, but the average temperature for Lubbock for the entire year was 61 degrees, and that comes out to the 30th warmest year on record, which we have just over 100 years of data. So, it's about the top third of temperatures, years throughout our records. That didn't feel as warm, and it certainly wasn't as the last couple of years. So we had the first and second warmest years on record over the last 2 years. So that definitely was cooler than the last few years, although it was still on the warmer side of average when you look at the longer term records. Precipitation wise, as we already kind of looked at, we had 12.61 inches officially of rainfall throughout the year at the Lubbock Airport. That was below average and also the 15th driest year on record. However, following the last 2 years, which we had the driest year on record, and then last year was better, but still not quite as wet as 2013. So we did trend the right way, and it may have actually almost seemed moist at some points, but it still was one of the drier years on records. And then just looking at the snowfall, we officially had 6.2 inches of snowfall, which is about in the middle of the road when you look at the long-term averages. About roughly half the years see more than that, half the years see less than that. But on average, that is 2 inches or so below the average on what we see on a normal year. Now we're going to look at some of the noteworthy weather events that affected the region. I won't dwell on this graph. You feel free to pause it and take a look if you'd like to, but we'll talk about a few of these particular events in more details in the coming slides. The first big weather event to hit the region occurred on February 25th, and it was a widespread blizzard that affected much of the region, the South Plains into the Panhandle. The worst of it was up in the Panhandle, where they saw over a foot of snow in places. Down here on the South Plains, generally from Lubbock northward, 4 to 8 inches of snow was pretty common. And along with that heavy snow, very strong north winds developed. 50 to 60 miles an hour were quite common, and even some gusts over 70 in a few spots. Of course, that strong wind coupled with that snow created a lot of drifting of snow. 5-foot drifts or greater were quite common, and even some 10-foot drifts were found up mostly in the Panhandle. Of course, all that snow and drifting snow led to a lot of travel difficulties, became difficult to impossible. You can see the one picture we have here that was captured from Lubbock on that day, on the 25th. A bunch of vehicles stranded in some blowing and drifting snow, and that conditions were much worse as you went further north up in the Panhandle. Amarillo particularly got blasted with 1.5 feet of snow or more, and giant drifts of snow. But we did get some beneficial moisture, and it made for some nice sights too after everything's calmed down and the roads were able to get cleared off. I particularly like the picture that was captured at Caprock Canyon State Park here of the bison enjoying their wintry wonderland. We'll jump ahead quite a bit as we went well into the spring. By early June, June 5th and 6th, we saw some severe weather affect much of the region. Thunderstorms developed out in eastern New Mexico and quickly organized into a squall line which raced across much of the South Plains. And then they eventually weakened and slowed down and dropped quite a bit of rainfall out in the rolling plains. Early on, we saw hail as large as baseballs fall in Friona. Then it became more of a wind event as it went into the central South Plains. There was damage reported in Levelland, and wind gusts in excess of 90 miles an hour were measured and or estimated in parts of Lubbock, the north part of Lubbock, and then down into Slayton. Of course, these strong winds did cause a lot of structural damage, knocked down power lines. Did take quite a while to recover at a number of locations after this pretty high impact event. And then out in the rolling plains, although they didn't really see any severe weather, they did see quite a bit of precipitation. Some spots saw 3 or more inches of rainfall over the following night as that system kind of decayed out there. So it was a very active start to June there. Just jumping ahead a couple weeks, we also saw some more active weather, which isn't atypical. That's when we see a lot of our severe thunderstorms and flash flooding. Spring months are quite common here in West Texas. But this particular day was very active. Initially kicked off with a slow-moving complex of thunderstorms that came out of the Texas Panhandle into the southeast Panhandle and northern rolling plains. Produced a little bit of severe weather in pockets, but the greater impact was the heavy rain it dumped. Upwards of 4 inches fell in some spots, most of it falling in an hour or less. And it did result in some extensive flooding in Caprock Canyon State Park, which you see a picture here to the right, of what is normally either dry or just a trickle of a flow through the stream there. It was obviously raging out of control and did a bunch of damage to the roadways there. After that activity faded, kind of died off into the afternoon hours, we saw an isolated supercell thunderstorm, which is a rotating thunderstorm, develop out near sundown. It developed quite rapidly, and it then produced a tornado. It was officially rated an EF2 tornado. You can see the storm below the text here. That's the storm that produced the tornado, and then the lower right, the actual tornado northwest of sundown. Thankfully, it didn't injure or kill anybody, but it did produce some strong winds, estimated up to 115 miles an hour, and went on for almost 2.5 miles, a maximum width of 350 yards, and it did destroy several structures, or damage several structures, so it caused a fair amount of damage out there in rural sections just northwest of sundown. Moving on into the fall and winter season, after a very warm stretch in mid-November where temperatures were well up into the 60s and even some 70s, we had a strong cold front move through. And this ushered in the beginning of a fairly long-lived winter storm that affected the region from the 21st through the 25th of November. We saw a prolonged and periodic stretch of freezing drizzle, freezing rain, and sleet across much of the area. And then it concluded with a bout of heavy snow as an upper-level storm system approached from the west. 6 to 9 inches of snow fell over much of the southern Panhandle and northwest South Plains, and you can see a few pictures from around the region. Up towards Muleshoe. In Muleshoe, they saw a good chunk of snow, I believe estimated at 8 to 9 inches, piled up there. Another beautiful picture from Caprock Canyon's area after the snow fell. And then in the lower right, you can just see some of the sleet and snow falling. That was at the Science Spectrum here in Lubbock on the early morning hours of the 24th. So did create some beautiful pictures, brought some nice snow to the area, some good moisture, but also created a lot of travel difficulties for many. Looking back at the tornado season for the region, and our region here in Lubbock is a 24-county area, kind of centered around Lubbock, goes up towards Childress and down to Aspermont, and then out west to the New Mexico-Texas state line. We saw 14 tornadoes in the Lubbock area, which is below average. but they still did cause some impacts, and we already discussed the one near sundown, which is shown here. A few other tornadoes are shown and the dates on which they occurred. Seven of the tornadoes that we were aware of that occurred in 2013 were of the supercell type, meaning they were spawned by a rotating thunderstorm. And then the other 7 were these landspout types, which can occur. They occur without the supercell. They don't have a rotating thunderstorm, just some rotation near ground level gets stretched and lifted and stretches out into usually a thin kind of a narrow tornado like we see in the one on the right here that occurred near Lorenzo. And they usually don't do much, if any, damage. But the strongest tornado was that one that we already discussed near sundown, the EF2. We had a couple other EF1 tornadoes. But overall, thankfully, not too much damage around the region, at least by tornadoes. Just a few final words, concluding looking at our summary for the year 2013. Like many years, it did provide many pleasant and uneventful days, and it was occasionally interrupted by our brief active stretches of weather. We saw anywhere from droughts to floods, large hail, damaging winds, several tornadoes as we just looked at, had a couple of dust storms, some heat waves, and some winter storms affect the region. So we saw our potpourri of impacts here, a lot of variety. And the year finished warmer and drier than average at most spots, as we saw early on. Drought conditions did improve modestly, but they did persist throughout the entire year. And if this didn't quench your thirst for information on the type of weather we saw in 2013 across the South Plains region, here's a couple other links you feel free to check out and can hopefully fill your heart with content. Thanks for listening.